Hello, welcome to my active reading expert presentation on the article Psychology and the Language Learning Process by Leontiev from 1981. Leontiev is a Soviet psychologist, psycholinguist, and it's noteworthy that this article was written in 1981, which is quite a while ago, but it's still relevant. So let's begin. I would say that the main assumption or the main thrust of this argument is that language is a purposive, that means it has a purpose, goal-directed activity with a definite aim or motive. So it's language is used by people to accomplish their goals. It's not just some abstract system that's existing on its own, which is the assumption of a few other schools of thought. So, as an overview to the presentation, there are two parts. Basically, in the first section, we'll discuss Leontiev's distinction, his three-way distinction between speech activity, speech acts, and communicative activity, and these three are embedded in context to differing degrees. After this, we'll discover how knowledge of the structure of speech acts can inform our instructional methods for language teaching. So our course 529 is about teaching English. So we'd like to learn how we can improve our language teaching, and we'll learn that through the medium of psychology here. Let's begin with the concept of a speech activity. So speech activity, according to Leontiev, just consists of producing the language. The student in a language learning classroom would produce the language with a focus on its phonological and grammatical correctness. So there is no purpose or aim. The student just wants to reproduce the sentence they are given. It's non-contextual. They just want to get the language right. And this is the first level of foreign language learning. Obviously, you need this to move forward. So the next level is a speech act. A speech act, according to Leontiev, is an utterance that is produced with a motive in order to accomplish a concrete task. So this is a big jump from the speech activity. This is where the concept of the motive comes in. The next part is kind of obscure. The goal of the speech act can be accomplished in a way other than with speech. So he calls it not exclusively verbal. Maybe an example can illuminate this. For example, if you want to close the door, it's concrete, it's a goal. You don't have to get up and close the door. You can ask somebody to do it for you. Please close the door. I think the reason he makes this distinction or he makes this special point is that to distinguish it from communicative activity, which we'll see is more involved in relationships and using speech, to foster human relationships. A speech act is to accomplish a concrete task that can be accomplished without not necessarily with language. The important thing is that there is a motive. An example of a speech act in the language learning classroom, which is what we're interested in, is dialogue. He calls it dialogic activity, and I'm interpreting this to be like role plays. I've taught EFL, and we do a lot of role plays. So we put students in a situation, imaginary situation, and they have to accomplish something in that situation. Maybe they're shopping for something at the store, and we have like little booths set up, not real booths, but groups of students, and they are buying and selling and things like that. Or maybe they're lost in a city and they have to follow a map. Not really, though. All right. And then producing a speech act requires that the grammatical rules are consciously applied in the speech act that are consciously applied in the speech activity from before become automatic. So they are unconsciously applied. And that makes the language much easier and faster. Okay. The third level is a communicative activity. This is the next step up from speech act. And communicative activity is contextual like speech acts, but it's not primarily focused on a concrete practical aim like the speech act. Its purpose, on the other hand, is to establish and maintain interpersonal relationships. So it's involved with social values and emotions. To give you a quote, the student says not only what he has to say, but also as it needs to be said in order to influence or to promote interaction. Okay, so I guess that's what a lot of people are interested in when they communicate. Some do it better than others. So let's move on. This is the second part of the presentation. I'm calling it applied psycholinguistics. Leontiev doesn't call it this, but I think that's an apt term. So Leontiev wants to use our knowledge of how language works in the brain in order to optimize language learning. He believes that the instructional method to teach a foreign language should mirror the mental processes that produce speech, and that way they would be more effective. And in the following slides, I'll talk about operations a lot, and this is kind of a technical term. I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but that's the fault of us not knowing a lot about how the brain works. But I would rephrase operations as mental processes, which might be more familiar to listeners of the general population. It's rather than operations. Okay, so these are just mental processes. Okay, so the first step of producing speech is the speech act. Leontiev says when we make an utterance, we don't begin with the speech, like the actual verbal production, the manifestation of the idea, but we begin with the idea. So as with any propulsive activity, there has to be a plan. He also calls it intention or program, technical term, for any future utterance. You might think of it as the idea with the goal. He says it's of a visual nature, which is arguable, but I would call it a representation because that's the prevailing terminology of today's field of cognitive science, which is the most up-to-date field dealing with how the brain works. So it's a structure in the brain. It's some kind of it's not an abstract kind of thing. It is instantiated in the brain, some kind of structure that represents an intention or a goal. So after you create this speech act intention, which we are from now going to call the program, which is one of the terms, the speaker then translates this program, the mental representation of the motive, again, into an utterance, the actual verbalized speech. When we're learning a foreign language, this translation is not direct. So when we are speaking our mother tongue, we just go from the program to the utterance. But when you're learning a foreign language, there's the intermediary of the mother tongue. If you can see this quick little heuristic, we go from the program to the utterance in the mother tongue, and then that is translated, for lack of a better word, to the utterance in the target language. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Okay. So like I said, Leontiev wants to know, over here I said that the second point, Leontiev believes that the instructional method to teach a foreign language should mirror the mental processes that produce speech, as opposed to teaching students the rules of translation from the surface features, my term, of the mother tongue to the target language. So he says not to focus on teaching students the rules of grammar that you see in grammar books to translate, but rather to use our knowledge of the mental operations, that's the next point, instead to teach them how to transition or translate or whatever you want to call between the operations of the two languages, which are the mental processes by which we, I guess, conceptualize those two languages. He mentions three types of transitions, very briefly, between operations of the mother tongue to the target tongue. He calls them simple transference which requires corrections and clarifications, and an operation formed from scratch. He only gives brief examples from specific languages, and these are just differing in the level of complexity of the transition or the transference. Okay, here's an important quote. The role of language teachers. As teachers, our task is to get rid of the intermediate stage. Over here we saw the utterance in the mother. It's actually, he's talking about the transition between the utterance in the mother tongue to the utterance in the target language. So get rid of the intermediate stage as quickly as possible, and to bring the this is a little bit hard to understand, and to bring the psychological structure of the utterance in the foreign tongue as close as possible to the psychological structure which operates in the mother tongue. So we want to get the mental processes or the operations in the that are operating in the mother tongue close to make that transition to the from those mental processes to the processes in the target language as quick and as close as possible, so that language becomes easier and more natural. And as we see, this means providing the student expediently with a system of operations which will be easy to convert and put into effect. He doesn't really go into too much detail about specifically what those operations are. Maybe he does in other articles, but right now it's kind of abstract. But you can kind of imagine what he might mean. So here's a quotation. I've already included a lot of quotations throughout this presentation, but here's an extra one. At the beginning of the article, he talks about external and internal motives for speech. So in the language learning classroom, the teacher who asks his pupil a question on the lesson is at the same time shaping a motive or a series of motives for the pupil's subsequent utterance. So this is the teacher's external motive. They want to affect the student to produce an utterance. So they employ their pedagogical skills. On the other hand, the quote continues, but the pupil may at the same time be guided by self-assertive motives, by the desire to gain or maintain prestige in the eyes of the teacher and of the class, etc. These are his internal motives. I added that. And these motives may furthermore turn out to be dominant. So in the language learning classroom, the student needs a motive to speak, and they can be taken from the teacher, which is not internal, or they may have their own internal motives. Okay, and this is important because when we want to get our students to speak, we need to give them a reason to speak, or they won't want to. Okay. Discovery, we covered a lot of discoveries, but here's an extra one. So the student only needs a certain minimal understanding of grammar and vocabulary in order to begin enacting speech acts. There's a certain base knowledge, but he will continue developing the grammar and vocabulary at the higher levels of the speech act and the communicative activity. So I would say that the 3 levels of speech are interactive and recursive. Okay, so you don't have to worry about getting everything perfect from the beginning. You'll continue to learn more grammar and vocabulary as you engage in more complex speech acts. Okay. My finally critical questions. I'd like to know, what are some other examples of speech acts other than dialogue, which is the one that Leontiev mentions, which can be used as a pedagogical tool in the classroom? I thought of role plays, which he doesn't mention, but then I paused and considered what I was thinking, and role play is a dialogue. It's usually almost always a dialogue. So I'm curious what other speech acts we can use in the classroom to facilitate the language learning of the student. And maybe you have some ideas about that. My second question, given that this article is written in 1981, what are some more recent developments in psycholinguistics? Do we have a better understanding of how language comes to be manifested in speech than we did in 1981? And I think we do, but this article is a good start. So, and that's the end of my presentation. So thank you for listening.